So the last part I'll talk about here, and it looks like we're about an hour early, so hopefully no one's tuning in an hour's time thinking they're going to hear this, is the development of the fish net effects assessment. This is just an overview. The detail of the analysis is in Chapter 5 of the public draft BDCP. The process is very similar to what you've seen before, reviewed before. Identification of important attributes. At one time we referred to these as stressors, but then some things couldn't really be considered stressors. They're just attributes of importance to species, so we're calling them attributes. A qualitative evaluation of the attributes, which includes assessing the current importance of the attributes to the different species, fish species, and the certainty associated with that. So something may be of low importance or moderate importance based on existing literature and other sources. And then the second component of the net effects assessment is assessing the change because of BDCP, and again, coming up with a qualitative assessment of the certainty associated with that. And one thing that we benefited from this time round in this process was some workshops that we had in August 2013 with agency biologists that allowed us to consider different perspectives, get input on things that we weren't certain about, and so on. And we've tried to summarize the range of opinion in our discussions in Chapter 5 for a given attribute, a given conclusion. So we've said what the range of the different opinions were in relation to importance and also in relation to change. Similar to what we've done over the past couple of drafts of the document, the conclusion for each attribute. So there's a conclusion for each attribute for each species by life stage, having determined which are the relevant attributes for a given species and life stage. The effect of BDCP is sort of the multiplication of the importance of the attribute by the change that we conclude to have occurred to the attribute from BDCP. And similarly, the certainty of the effect is the product of the certainty of its importance times the certainty of its change. And I mentioned on the previous slide that it was a qualitative assessment. So during the assessment of importance or change, each of the attributes was given a qualitative assessment of no importance or no change, low importance, moderate importance, moderate change, high. Very high change or critical importance. We actually said critical for the importance on that. But essentially 5 different categories there. And the product, so the effect, as I mentioned before, was the kind of combining these two things. And so having converted these qualitative words into like rankings here, this allowed these two to be sort of multiplied together and gave a range of products which then could be converted back into a qualitative assessment. So the breakpoints for these basically were in relation to, for example, a high importance coupled with a high level of change was assumed to be a high effect. So a 3 times a 3 would be a 9, and so on. So a critical importance times a very high change was assumed to be a 16. And so it's kind of a non-linear type scale. Each conclusion was made independently for these attributes for the different life stages of the different species. There is obviously some overlap in these attributes. We tried to characterize them as best we could, but they do overlap to some extent. And so in the final assessment is qualitative, and it's not a summing of all the different scores for all the different attributes across all the different life stages for a species. It's a general assessment given the conclusions for each of the different attributes. I know the previous panel comments we definitely heard was the idea of summing, but we didn't go there because of the difficulties that we felt with just trying to. We didn't feel it was appropriate to try and add up all these things, but instead to come up with a qualitative overall assessment, having looked at each of the things individually. This example here, and this is my last slide, this is just an example for delta smelt, taken from chapter 5 of the effects analysis. As an example for juvenile delta smelt, the overall category of food, looking at zooplankton abundance. So this was based on literature and pretty good agreement during our agency workshop. So this is of critical importance with high certainty. Primarily based on tidal habitat restoration, there was we concluded that there would be potential for a moderate change, but that there would be low certainty in that moderate change because of the factors that we discussed earlier this morning. For example, consumption by clams. So overall, combining these two things was the overall conclusion was a moderate effect of BDCP with low certainty. And so our graphic, and this is what we've now evolved to, is this tabular format where we have the effect in words and we have the certainty in colors. You can see here that this example is for juvenile delta smelt, zooplankton abundance, a moderate positive change to this attribute because of BDCP, but with low certainty. So that's an overview of the fish net effects assessment, and as I mentioned, the detail is in chapter 5, so I hope you get a chance to read that. If there's any questions.
Just a small point, that when looking at this table, which button? The red one. Positive or negative. Most of them are, I know, positive effects.
Right.
But but when I was looking at it, just skimming through, couldn't readily identify negative without going back to the text.
Do you have a specific suggestion for improving the readability, or?
I haven't thought about it that much, but I was just wondering, sort of an obvious thing to identify positive and negative.
It would be appropriate to put plus minus signs.
Yeah.
It looks like you
Plus
put
and
minus.
Well, the minuses are on there. So, for example, it's hard to see on this excerpt, but for example, the North Delta intakes, those are very low minus, very low minus, very low minus. So,
how do you know it's minus? Does it say minus on there? Maybe it's too small and I can't see it. Okay. That could be it.
we could use something like different colors or something like that. Maybe red font or something like that.
Yeah.
I guess another question, though, with regard to this, you have sort of quantitative framework of multiplying the magnitude with the level, and you do that on an attribute by attribute basis. But then when it comes to an overall synopsis, it seems more heuristic.
Yeah, it's. I wouldn't put it. I wouldn't say as coarse as eyeballing the table, but it is, considering the overall assessment of the different attributes. It is an overall qualitative assessment rather than a strict summing.
Why go through partially quantitative and then drop back to the qualitative?
Partly the difficulty in knowing this necessarily, that, although we have tried to characterize the importance of the different attributes, I think there is overlap in some of these things, and so it's difficult then to be able to say that you could actually add all of them up.
I wanted to add to that too. I think in our last review, you suggested that we actually apply the bar chart approach, sum it up, and apply it to terrestrial. And so we spent a lot of time really looking at how to best summarize these results. And I think, as you heard today, a lot of attributes were evaluated 3, 5, 8 different ways. And so applying a single, quantitative conclusion to that became difficult, or we didn't have a quantitative conclusion, or in some instances, we talked a lot with the agencies about flow as a master driver, and some of the different tools we're using are overlapping in what they're measuring. And so, that's why we didn't end up summing them up. And so when we went back to look at, should we refine these bar charts some way, I think what we kind of decided was that a lot of this is complicated enough and requires a reader to understand enough of it that this was a more appropriate way of presenting the information, because it does kind of require that the reader read what is here and try to understand pieces of it versus being able to quickly skim across a bar chart, which might be too superficial for understanding what the analysis is really saying. So we tried to find something that is a nice visual summary, but that you do have to kind of dig in a little bit to understand what it's saying.
I'm not trying to be argumentative. I like the chart, I like this, but when it comes to your final dots it out, a small, moderate positive effect of moderate certainty, you try to look at the chart and try to figure out where that comes from, and now it becomes much more, I don't know, I was going to use the words capricious, not capricious, it's just less clear.
Okay.
So I know that there's a danger doing it all quantitative, and there's a danger doing sort of ocular.
Right.
But it's not necessarily, it's not going to be the same conclusion based depending on the eye of the beholder.
Right. So the actual final conclusions aren't really presented in these tables, because here they're still broken down by each attribute and each life stage. The final conclusion is really more of a narrative that varies between about a page to 2 pages for each species. So we're still not coming down to, we do make a conclusion about its ability to meet the HCUP and NCCPA standards, but we're not, I think what you're looking for is in a one sentence where everything that backs it up is Chapter 5. So, but we're open to suggestions. This is certainly an area we struggled. We reread your suggestions many, many times and worked with the fish agencies and just trying to figure out how do you best present all of this when ultimately we can't sum this up. We can't sum it quantitatively. We did that qualitatively, and that's really the final page or 2 of each species conclusion. Definitely open to suggestions, though.
Sorry. An ocular summary is still a weighted summary. You just aren't telling us what the weighting scheme is.
Right, but I guess I'm saying I'm very open to what that would look like. We've tried a bar chart, we're trying this. So in each case, though, we're still breaking it down by attribute and life stage. And so I think it sounds to me that there's a desire to kind of have some visual of like the big picture all together. And we're trying to figure out what that best, way to present that is. So struggling.
And then often you'll talk about splitting up between foragers versus migrants. You put 25% or 75%, then at the beginning, and that disappears in the conclusions as well in terms of how you get the overall summary. So you sort of have this quantitative structure facade at the beginning, and sort of wanes and wanes and wanes to evaporates at the conclusions.
Okay.
I had another comment. I thought it was interesting bringing in the results from your August 2013 workshop with agency personnel and describing certainty, uncertainty, and differences of opinion. I thought that was useful. But I was wondering if it sounded like you had people ranking certainty, and that if you could have used those scores to provide an estimate of variability among the agency personnel that were scoring these, as opposed to just you characterized it with words in Chapter 5. But
right.
It would have been another measure, sort of a semi-quantitative measure of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that ultimately there's just one thing written down there as far as the level of certainty, but to some extent that does reflect the diversity of opinion already in the narrative section in the qualitative assessment summarizes, like you say, the diversity of opinion. So I think it'd be good to get feedback from the panel. Was that done reasonably? I mean, is the conclusion that you see for the importance of a given attribute and for the change because of BDCP to a given attribute, did you see where that came from based on the information that you have to hand? And actually, ultimately, of course, the final conclusions, ocular or otherwise, could you see where that came from?
Yeah, I guess the difference is if you have people in a workshop scoring certainty, you take that metric and it's unfiltered, whereas the moderate, high, moderate, low is filtered.
Right.
Filtered estimate.
Yeah.
So
I sort of agree too. It seemed like at the workshop you had levels of ranking of intensity, and you had different distributions of people's ranking. How you could down a Delphi or decision analysis on it, and either use that as an alternative or sensitivity analysis on this result, or are the results of that workshop the conclusions of your net effects?
Right. Yeah, there are different things. People did receive attribute tables similar to these, and in some cases people filled a lot of them out. In other cases they had less time, and so they were providing comments during the workshops themselves, and then they weren't necessarily independent. Some people weren't certain of things, and so some individuals had more feeling for something and others deferred to them, and so it certainly was a useful process, but it wasn't it wasn't the same as some of the more formal type processes where you have like a qualitative panel type procedure.
So the point there was to fill in some of these relative weights on an attribute by attribute basis from the workshop. What were you gaining from the workshop, and how does it integrate with this table?
We were gaining perspective, and in some cases where we weren't certain, we had a value from a previous iteration of the effects analysis. Agency personnel may have provided a better rationale for something, and we considered that. And so that might have been reflected in the change value that we had. In other cases, the agencies, they looked at the tables that we had from previous versions of the effects analysis and thought, yeah, we find that reasonable. We don't see any need to change it. So it was definitely a combination.
I think there was also a lot of discussion about defining the attributes, and so you'll see that they are some of them are the same as you saw before when we called them stressors, but there are new ones, and I think they're better defined. And so especially for, I think, the upstream analyses, there's better delineation of flow versus temperature effects in each of the upstream areas and taking a closer look at that. So I think for us that they helped confirm where there was agreement among the agencies in the previous analysis and interpretation and where there was disagreement. But as Marin mentioned before, there were very few instances where there was disagreement around a certain effect. And so that's where the narrative comes in describing the range of opinions in the room. Ultimately, these tables, in our conclusion, reflect our interpretation based on the whole record, what we heard in the meetings, what we know as being probably the most intimately familiar with the analyses, and trying to capture all that in a final conclusion as part of the application process. So I think there'll still be work to do with the fish agencies. I think after that process we went and wrote this up, and so they're looking at it, and we'll continue these conversations, and the goal would be by the final plan to all be exactly on the same page around each attribute and how we've captured the effect based on the tools we have.
Yeah, I would add that the agencies weren't just given, they were given tables similar to this, but it wasn't a case of these are the attributes and that's it. Some of the attributes were added based on comments during those workshops. The definitions of some of the attributes were refined. As Jennifer alluded to, there are still issues in the interpretation of some of what might go into different attributes too. And so we've tried to reflect that in our discussion in Chapter 5 where that existed.
And a lot of those are actually the subject of your charge. So we are hoping that your input will help us resolve some of those areas where we're struggling to come to a common interpretation around the effects or the certainty of those effects or how those effects should be ultimately characterized as part of the overall net effects.